The views expressed in the following video are those of the individual panel member participants and do not necessarily represent the opinions or position of Empirical Assessment Solutions or the Goldie Company. Resilience 2020 project has been created to seek input from Canadian charitable nonprofit sector representatives to share experiences, their challenges, their perceptions, and insights into how to best move forward in the short term and beyond during these unprecedented COVID-19 times. We've carried out surveys, focus groups, and now we're engaging in experts in discussions on key issues. We have heard that now is the time to examine essentially all aspects of operations. And for many charitable nonprofits, this exploration includes the role that boards play within their organization. To discuss this issue, we have Daniel Tessier-Young from the Goldie Company, Ken Wyman from Ken Wyman and Associates, and Gail Picco, editor-in-chief from the Charity Report. Welcome, everyone. So exactly what is the role that boards are designed to play?
Well, they're pretty crucial. As a fundraiser, I've got to say that if the board is working properly, you don't have fundraising problems. If the fundraising is working properly, you're going to still have to deal with board issues. The board is supposed to be looking after everything on behalf of, well, that's the problem. On behalf of who? In too many cases, it's really not clear.
Well, I think the board is one of the few requirements that the CRA has of a charitable organization. You know, you get your charitable registration, and the one thing you need besides filing regular financial forms is you have to have a board of directors. So the way the law is set up, it is the one indispensable. You don't need staff, you don't need other volunteers, you don't even really need to have connections with the constituency, but legally you have to have a board of directors. So a board of directors is indispensable. In terms of who they are responsible to, my feeling, and other people have different ideas, is that they are responsible to the Canadian public. It is Canadian regulations that have allowed them to exist with favored status. They're not taxed. They are allowed. They have the ability with no upper limit to issue tax receipts for charitable causes. So they can give tax credits for donations to anyone. So I view that their ultimate responsibility is to the Canadian public because that's who empowers them. And secondarily, their responsibility is to the people their charitable purpose exists to serve.
A critical element of the new federal and provincial regulatory environment for not-for-profit organizations is need for more openness, transparency, and accountability. And that's a critical role that the board has. And so it's been a period of adjustment for many boards because many of them are focused on a very select audience. And that's a little bit broader now. And so it has meant a period of training, retraining, focusing on more communication and information sharing at that level with their targeted audience. And of course, that all of that has to be made public as well.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of bureaucracy that is a key part of this.
You could call it bureaucracy, or you could call it transparency. And you know, of the 85,000 charities that exist in Canada, only 40% of them have a website. So here we have these organizations which are empowered with significant financial privileges, but have no public-facing element to them at all. So what is that about? Like, is it because they're doing work in their community, but nobody really knows about it? So I think that there's a level of transparency that if a charity is going to be a charity, then it needs to commit to ways that it's going to communicate its message to the public. So I think a basic website with contact information is one of those ways.
Okay, and the board's role in that is to make sure that happens?
Ensure that it's done, that it ensure that it meets the I mean, obviously it's not required, it's not
Yeah.
mandated to have a website, but that it set itself up to have measures of transparency as it creates its own organization.
I'll build on that and suggest that every organization that has a website, and yes, it makes sense in this day and age that all should have a list of who's on the board on the
Mhm,
website
mhm.
with their bios and how to contact them,
Yes.
so that we break down this barrier where the public can't contact the board, where in some larger organizations, staff are explicitly prohibited from talking with the board. We need to open up that communication so that everybody who has a question or a concern can be directly in touch with a board member. That should be encouraged,
Yeah.
mandated, structured into the board's role rather than something that may or may not ever happen.
Mhm.
Another challenge is the fact that many boards, especially as they recruit new members, are not aware or not fully aware of their roles and responsibilities, and that has to change under the new
Mhm.
regulatory regime. And so, from my perspective, not-for-profits are not spending enough time training their new recruits and even their existing board structures about these new regulations and their duties as
Mhm.
a director. And so there's that gap there that needs to be addressed in a relatively short period of time, because these rules are important and public accountability is critical to the whole process. And if you're
Mhm.
not training your directors properly, that's a gap and a failure on their part.
When I think of boards, I think in terms of giving direction to how an organization actually functions, key decisions, key directives, and that hasn't been part of your description to much of an extent. Why not?
Well, the board is the boss. The
Yeah.
board is the captain of the ship. The board hires the CEO, and then the CEO hires the staff. That is a typical corporate governance structure. So, for example, let's talk about the we thing as an example here. And we is very typical of a certain kind of charity. And it's a charity that is a founder charity and is still very much influenced by its founders. Now, there are a lot of charities operating that are very much under the influence of its founders. And the board of directors kind of follow their lead. But in the we instance, there was an example of a person who was then the chair of the board, had been on the board for 14 years, and said she didn't have access to the financial information. To me, that is not credible. It's not a credible position for a board member to say that they didn't have access to the financial information. It's their responsibility. If there was one thing that a board is to do, it is to be responsible for the financial operation of the organization. Like, how many documents did that board member or any board member in her position sign? This grant or this tax return, that had financial information. So that the very notion that a board of directors would ever be able to say, well, I didn't know that, would, I think, have to show that there was a consciousness over a long period of time not to provide boards with that adequate information. But boards have access to the auditors. They hire the auditors, they appoint the auditors. They have access to bookkeepers and so on. So a board of directors needs to understand that the buck stops with them.
And far too many boards are passive. They see themselves as supporting the executive director and not as the boss. They take what they're given and they rubber stamp it. The Canadian Museum of Human Rights, the chair of the board, is also saying, I was so surprised when. Well, there shouldn't be a surprise.
No.
And I've seen this in so many boards.
Yes.
I saw another board where the accountant said, well, I trust them. I don't have access to those financials, but I'm sure they're okay. Well, we need Rambo the accountant to go in there and demand the papers.
Yeah.
And to the credit of the chair of the board of when she demanded that information and was denied it, she resigned. We need board members who will stand up. Uh, Daniel raised a good point about not training board members in their responsibilities, but also their legal obligations. For any board members who are watching, let's start off with a simple truth. You are financially responsible for that organization. If there's a bankruptcy, if there's a successful lawsuit because of harassment or discrimination, after they've gone after all the charities' assets, you personally are liable. They can take your house. They can take your bank accounts. And if that doesn't make you want to resign right now, it should at least make you want to ask a whole bunch more tough questions.
So the issue of the fact that many boards, in fact, the vast majority of boards, do not have staff, and they rely on directors to perform the duties. And that's where much of the focus is. And that's problematic in that the oversight, the openness, the transparency, the accountability, all those legal and regulatory requirements are set aside. Not because it's not important, it's because you're a volunteer and you've been asked to create a newsletter or do a fundraising letter or contact people to raise funds and so forth. So that's what the goal is of the charitable organization or the not-for-profit. And so all of those things are set aside because there's no structure in place to provide that information to new people as they come on board, because they don't have the staff, they don't have the history, they don't have the archives, they don't have access and so forth. So that's an important oversight on and needs to be addressed. How we do that, I guess, is open for discussion.
When my son started to work in his first job, he had to do Smart Serve in order to work in the bar industry in Ontario, and other provinces probably have similar things. I've always thought that something which, like a Smart Serve course, should be essential for anybody who sits on the board of a charity. A 12-hour online course that you have to pass, with reading materials, that you have to understand the basics of what being a board member of a charity are. The amount of privilege that is given over to charity based on the idea of good intention, of inherent good intention, it's not any longer plausible. And board members could have saved we and many other charities from a world of hurt if they had just exercised their power. But many board members allow themselves to be directed by founders. This is not just a single instance. I can think of 5 other organizations who are not as public as we, but who have the founders running the show, staff and board. And in my research, 50% of organized charities who transition from founder-led to arm's-length led survive. So that the idea that if that charitable mission is important, it needs to be taken up by a constituency beyond its founder. And that is an essential part of the evolution of a charitable organization.
Typically, are board members volunteers, or are they typically paid?
Not paid. In Canada, you cannot be paid as a board member. They are volunteers. It's possible that they can have a job with the charity or occasionally get expenses reimbursed, but when they are acting as board members, they must be volunteers.
So we're asking people to take responsibilities for these organizations, put their name on the line, and be accountable for something that's strictly a volunteer thing. Is that a problem?
It's a challenge. There are other components to that as well, because most boards are not only responsible for those requirements, but they're also responsible for the various activities that the charity or the not-for-profit will has as priorities. And so the strategic planning component is critical. And a lot of boards don't update or don't do strategic planning on a regular basis. And so you get into this cycle of just recruiting new people, and they stay for the short term and they do what they think they've been asked to do. But all those important tasks that need to be addressed, those legal requirements, the strategic planning and the implementation of that plan and the metrics and so forth that go along are set aside. And so the end result is that a lot of associations tend to drift and aren't as successful as they should be, or could be perhaps. And so what happens to the volunteers is they lose interest because they've been asked to mail a half dozen letters or whatever the case is, and then for them that's their contribution. But it's much more than that, and there's not enough information provided by the sector about their roles and responsibilities and the training that goes along with that. And Gail raises a good point about, well, where do you get this kind of information? It's simply not, well, it's there, but it's not easily accessible, and there's no one to point to set that direction to provide that access.
Why is it structured this way?
That goes all the way back to the history of philanthropy and the history of charities. There's a great book out now from the University of Manchester about the reputation of philanthropy. And at the Charity Report, we just recently did a photo essay on the paintings that were done in Dutch Renaissance paintings from the 17th century that were pictures of the people who were on the boards of directors of various orphanages at the time. And it hasn't changed a lot since, the 17th century Dutch Renaissance. There's a group of people in society who are concerned about the poor, who are concerned about educating children, who are concerned about people down on their luck and want to help. And so they get together, they constitute an organization, and then they go about the business of raising money and providing workers or themselves working in, whether it's a poorhouse or an orphanage or whatever the case may be. It really hasn't changed very much, except that what the charity sector is now set up to do is essentially deliver healthcare, education, and social services as the government's vehicle for public policy. So it's a huge sector, $260 billion a year, but it's all resting on this teeny tiny little point of boards of directors who are running that $260 billion a year. The foundation is so weak that you could blow it over with a feather. And it is because the governance rules, because I think that people believe in the inherent good of charity, so that they don't look at it in a critical way to say, well, is an orphanage the best thing for a child? Or, there's this idea of an inherent good where we have to look at charities to see, are they, is this good public policy? Is this to the benefit of society? So, but in the meantime, there can be no mistake. It's black letter law that what happens in an organization is the responsibility of a board of directors, no matter how they want to spin that out in a controversy or a story. There should be no way that the chair of the board of directors should be able to then become the interim CEO at the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg. Like, how is that even allowed? That an organization that oversaw an environment that was toxic, racist, and homophobic could now be in the position of power.
Gail raised the topic of membership and people who make up the various boards and so forth. And younger Canadians are drawn to social activism. And the use of technology is so effective. And within 24 hours, you can rally behind a cause and be more effective than running it through a charity. And charitable sector and the not-for-profit sector are way behind in leveraging technology and social media and so forth. And so for the younger generation who've grown up with that technology, it's second nature. It's their instincts to do that.
Yeah.
And so they're drawn to that. Whereas the not-for-profit charitable sector has had the same structure in place for decades, and as Gail pointed out, perhaps even centuries. And there needs to be a change in that mindset, and an attempt to recruit younger people to come in, but also begin to think about how best to leverage technology and have more rapid response to things, because most strategic plans in the charitable sector are anywhere from 5 to 10 years, which is way too long to engage anybody in a process. So
Yeah.
That has to change, and I'm not sure there's a discussion in place to make those changes happen.
The core of the problem is still how people get on boards in the first place. And in the vast majority of cases, it's who knows who.
Yep.
The nomination process is minimal. Often at the very last minute, they look for whatever warm bodies are willing to occupy the chair without taking on too much responsibility. They'll lie and say, well, you don't really have to do much of anything. You come to a few meetings a year, and we have coffee, and it's all very pleasant. And the result is that we have self-reproducing boards who are not elected by anybody, although clearly and technically they are elected by the membership, but in the vast majority of cases, the membership is the board, and it's a circular process. Now, half the charities in Canada are places of worship. And all right, they're going to elect board members from among their membership. That certainly makes sense. But the process of cultivating, of having board members in training, of building up the skills, of having a constituency that is involved in making the choice in electing people on the board, of saying, okay, if we want to have somebody representing a wide variety of diversities, of people of color, of indigenous people, of young people, of women, that there be some intelligent selection process rather than the self-serving rebuilding. George Stenois told me recently of an organization where 4 out of the 5 board members lived in the same condo building.
Right.
It's not terribly surprising. They know who they know, and they talk to who they think will be friendly, rather than having a longer term process. I would love to see the kind of thing that, well, Harvard University does a fairly good job of this, actual elections for board members in which all of the alumni of Harvard get to vote, and there are more candidates put forward than positions, so it's not just an approved slate in advance. And it's actually gotten to the point now where there's a group of young people who have put forward a political party and are challenging in the elections to see who should come forward and be part of the board of overseers at Harvard University.
Yeah.
So we need to have a much more democratic process than we do now.
Yeah. Just to follow up on Ken's point, and I think that there's 2 points here. And one is that the idea that these new charities are bubbling up from community organization and going through this evolution of becoming a charitable organization. In Canada, we have 1 charity for every 500 people. And so we should, if we organized it along that way, we would have our little charity neighborhoods. But in practice, the charities that are come into being are very often, there is a founder who, usually because of a personal disaster, a death in the family of a child, or suicide, or some kind of personal reason, decides they want to have a charity. And so they go out and they recruit their friends and people with power. And very often these new charities aren't the community organizations that are bubbling up naturally. They are people who will recruit lawyers, accountants, bank executives, judges in some cases. And these are the charities that whose founders have a pool of white people at leadership. And that's why the charity sector, the charity leadership sector in Canada is like a bar of ivory soap. It's like 99.9% pure white. It's extraordinary. Like that takes a lot of work to do that. So, but what's going on outside the charity movement, if you think of the movement as a dome, are all of these community organizing groups that are coming from Jane and Finch, the north end of Winnipeg, that are totally outside that charity structure. I worked at Jane and Finch for almost a year, and most of the organizations there are associated with other groups. There's a very small charitable footprint in that community, and that's replicated across communities across the country. So you have the structure of the charity sector, which is led by white people, and then you have this what's happening and bubbling up around the charity sector, which is organizations that are coming together for social justice, right? And these are two very different things. And
so it's sort of like what Daniel was actually talking about earlier in terms of young people just getting involved in doing things.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, what Daniel was talking about.
Okay, so you've raised a whole number of issues, whether it be accountability, learning and training, their succession planning, and issues like that, lack of responsiveness, all these sorts of things. So what's the solution? How can things change? What's necessary to happen to improve what's happening? Because what you're kind of describing is that what's bubbling up beside here is something that is more agile, able to actually respond, whereas the structure of charitable organizations just aren't able to. So how do you make the adjustments necessary so that charitable nonprofits stay relevant?
Well, one place to start from my perspective is with the strategic planning. There are many facets to this, but if you can start with that, that's an easy win for most organizations if they can set the time aside to have an annual session where they talk about their strategic plan, where they update it, where they look at the gaps, where they look at issues like training, diversity, increasingly important, to pick up on Gail's point, and so forth. And so if they can start with that simple, basic, low-cost step, I think that's a good way to start the whole process. Now, a much larger discussion needs to take place. Major changes are in order, but at the grassroots level, that's where I would begin.
There's one model that's been proposed that worries me. Suggestions that we should have a government representative appointed to boards and greater board regulation. That didn't work with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where there are many government appointed board members. It doesn't particularly work for the Toronto Zoo, where the city appoints board members. There are all kinds of situations where funders have appointed boards and governments have over-regulated them. I don't think that's the right answer. I prefer to see a much more democratic model. I would look where the minimal transparency that we have now, where charities are required to report to the government once a year with their T3010s, that we clarify who the membership is, who is entitled to elect the board, and call for wider democracy so that we don't have a founder saying, well, I'm going to invite 3 friends, because that's the minimum. You only need 3 people on the board. And that's the membership. So those 3 people choose their successors. And we need to say, if you are in any way issuing tax receipts, you're responsible to the Canadian public. In what way are you allowing the Canadian people to be engaged in choosing those board members? Let's have a wider membership. Now, there's going to be some variation. Clearly, there are a whole bunch of organizations that are essentially focused on themselves, places of worship, for example, or recreation and sports programs, and they are going to choose board members and from their own group. It gets more problematic as we move towards organizations serving others, such as social service organizations, where we may get people with a savior complex deciding that they're going to do something for those poor people without necessarily involving those poor people in making any of those decisions. So I would argue that in most cases, the people who benefit from the charity should have 50% of the positions on the board or more. Now, there are exceptions to that. And we go to in the model of from self to other to an extreme of environmental and animal rights organizations that are designed to help people and animals and environments who have no voice. And okay, I'm not suggesting that the puppies and the kittens should be making all of those decisions, nor am I suggesting that an Alzheimer's organization or a dementia organization should have people with Alzheimer's and dementia on the board. Although I've met many boards where there were people with dementia and Alzheimer's on the board, and it sounds like a joke, but it's not.
No,
And clearly an organization that's looking after babies doesn't have to have babies on the board. So there are exceptions to that. But we have a savior complex. There's far too many people who take a trip to Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and come back and say, oh, we have to start a charity to help those people. And they do. And there's a court case that's just been going on with somebody who started up an organization to provide healthcare. She had no medical background whatsoever, and the treatments that she provided actually made people sick.
Right.
So we need to have some greater sense of control.
Leadership in the charity sector, which is boards, is the weakest link. And so if you want to make significant improvements in the impact and the accountability and transparency of a charity, you need to address yourself to the weakest link, and that is board governance. The UK Charity Commission has a ton of reference material for boards of directors and what their job is and how they deal with certain situations. It's a very good setup. I think Canada should have something similar. A resource, a federally led resource center for boards of directors. But the issue is almost intractable in my view. I mean, you have private foundations who are charities that are all family members. So there's no 13 of the biggest private foundations in the country are run by the family. So we're not even getting out of the gene pool, let alone the diversity, right? So this is a very tricky problem. But I think unless we look at that weakest link, that we're not going to see, significant improvement.
Joe, you stated that the starting point is the weakest link is leadership, and dealing with weak leadership begins with education. Is that the starting point in terms of training and developing a learning organization to move forward? Is that, if you were to choose one thing to begin the process of fixing this issue, is it that?
Well, let me put a little bit of a stick with the education carrot, and I think that education should be regulated for people who are joining boards of directors of charities. So I'm back to my Smart Serve example. Right. In order to join a board, you have to complete 12 hours of online study and answer 25 multiple choice questions to get a little, you could act, it's Smart Serve, right? It's another way of serving smartly.
I'd like to build on that slightly. There are some board training programs now available through organizations like UltraVest. There are some videos that CRA puts forward. I love your suggestion, Gail, that there be 25 questions you have to answer. It's not just watch the video. I spoke a few days ago with Sharon Lee, who's the executive director of a disease organization. She suggested that board members should not only have to be certified in the same way that you're talking about, as many fundraisers are CFREs, but like CFREs, they have to be recertified. So that it's not just once and done. Once a year or once every 3 years, there's some evidence of further education and training. Make sure you can still answer those original 25 questions and maybe 25 more now.
Great. Daniel, last words to you.
Well, from my perspective, the issue of diversity and so forth is very important. But I think setting aside the need for regulations and so forth, and I'm not entirely convinced that that's the route to take. I think both Ken and Gail have raised some good points, but it starts at home, and it starts among the community. And increasingly, because of the social activism that's out there, we're becoming more aware of the needs of others. And I think if boards can start with that, and personal development, and I know it sounds, a bit high, too broad and so forth, but it really does start within the community. And if boards can sit back and take a look at their community and who they're serving, and make a deliberate effort to incorporate that community into their decision-making process, how they go about doing things, I think that's probably more effective than, "Hi, we're from government and we're here to help." To me, I think that's just, it's a non-starter, and it has to be organic, because you can't force people to change their mindset through regulation. It has to be, they have to learn that. They have to grow within a community that accepts diversity, whether it's people of color, whether it's the LGBTQ community and so forth, indigenous communities, which I'm sort of part of through my family. I think all of those types of things are critical. And perhaps that's where the focus needs to be in the short term. And all of those things about regulation and so forth can come afterwards.
Thank you all. It's been a great discussion. And I think I've certainly learned a lot about what the problems are, and the potential for solutions there too. It's interesting. This was brought on by COVID and the reactions to it. And the C word wasn't mentioned once in this discussion. But
so over that.